We are in for a special treat. If you're a fan of Police Off the Cuff, you know how we're growing, how we're expanding. The guests that we have.
You're gonna tell them that we were nominated as the fourth podcast in the country to watch in year
there's
2000.
A blog that came out. Whoever wrote it, my cousin John. 4, really, bro? I get the top 15, but you gave us 4? No, that's how some of these things work. But this one, it didn't work that way. I don't even know these people, but whoever you are, what's the name of it?
Blog Post.
Sounds legit to me. Yeah. Put us on the map. It sounds legit to me. So, we were ranked number 4. So that's the bet. That's little things to come. We'll be number 1 soon. But like I said, the podcast is expanding, and it's expanding in this rate, which is what I'm so excited about. Is that, of course, we've had a ton of great law enforcement officers come through here and tell their stories. We had a couple of prosecutors. We had medical examiner Barbara Butcher.
Some
we
academics.
Had a PhD, Dr. Maki.
Haberfeld.
And now we're going into the investigative work. So our guest today is an award-winning investigative journalist, author, columnist, and editor, and is considered an expert on government, law enforcement, criminal justice, organized crime, and terrorism. Let's put it together, folks, for Murray Weiss. Thanks for coming in.
No, it's a pleasure to be here.
Great to meet you, Murray.
Thanks for asking me.
Yeah, I'm really, really, really excited
and
today.
Before he gets nervous, he also now is a producer at 48 Hours for CBS.
Yeah.
You got to get that plug in early.
We get it. We're going to talk all about 48 Hours. We're going to talk about CBS. But I also, what we like to do here on the show, I don't know if you've listened to episodes in the past, what we like to do is we like to basically get to find out who we're talking to, because some of the people that we introduce our audience to may not be, like you're basically like, you're a celebrity, Murray. You've been around for a long time. But most, a lot of people you can't Google. Because we have a lot of law enforcement. They might be, heroes in our world, but to the average person, they might not know them. So what we like to do is we get the background. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. I always start off with the same question. Murray, where are you from?
I was born in the Bronx. We spent a few years in Queens, and then I grew up in Nassau in East Meadow.
Okay.
Nassau County. I went to East Meadow High School. Oh, really? We were in neighboring communities. Wow. I went to Queens College when I got out of high school, and then I got a job at the New York Daily News, an entry-level job at the New York Daily News, at the worst hours at the bottom of the heap.
What was your route?
That's why you say that, but my father was a driver for the Daily News.
That's a good union job, though. He did all right.
And he's just whipping at you from out the truck while you're running.
They kill more people than serial murderers, those guys.
No.
It's all in those big packs of newspapers.
The old days, man.
They had some organized crime issues.
Were you at the
that
stand
union,
with the paperboy hat on? And
No. He was a driver for the news. It was a tough job, actually, not unlike the police world.
Was it like a union job, too, back then?
Yes, it was.
And your degree wasn't in journalism, right?
No, I majored in philosophy.
Philosophy.
Oh, man.
Yeah, I majored in philosophy.
That helps you bullshit your way out of things, right?
It turned out to be very helpful, actually.
It reminds me of, what was the movie, Life? He says to him, what is your occupation, when they got to step up and they tell the occupation so they can get their welfare check? And the History of the World, Part 1.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's funny. Mel Brooks, no?
Yeah, it was Mel Brooks. He
That's
says,
funny.
I'm a philosopher. Oh, a professional bullshit artist. Something like that, was it?
Something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
When I was in college, my dad sat me down in the kitchen, or he joined me in the kitchen, and he had one of those, father-son moments where he asked me, Murray, what are you studying? And I was like a senior maybe then. Yeah. And
what, in high school or in college?
I was in college.
Okay.
I was in college, and I said, I'm studying philosophy. And he looked at me and he said, he said, the last time I looked in the newspapers, I didn't see too many, philosophers wanted and help wanted pages.
I'm just curious, like, what type of kid were you? Was this just to get laid? You wanted to get into philosophy?
No. If I wanted to do that, when I graduated, I actually got some scholarships to go to graduate school in California and other places, but
you would have fit right in there.
I would have become like a professor of philosophy, talking to all these young, pretty surfer girls, and I probably would have had a lot more fun than I did.
How'd you convince the Daily News to hire you with a philosophy degree?
That's Well, my dad worked there, so I guess I had a tiny leg up. But the truth is, I wanted, growing up where we grew up, if you grew up in Levittown, I was chomping at the bit to get out of there, to be honest with you. Sure. And you became a law enforcement person, so maybe we have something in common in the sense that you want to do things that have a lot more activity. You want to meet and talk to different people and have different kinds of life experience. I also wanted to be a writer. And when I got out of school, it was like, well, what am I going to do? So I came home one day. My father told me this story many years later, not too long before he passed, actually. We were chatting. And he said, I came home one day, and I said to him in his bedroom, I said, hey, you'll never guess where I went today. And he goes, where'd you go? I said, I went to the Daily News. And I went up there to get a job. I was pretty much out of college. And the guy who did the hiring said to me, I went there, I had a little tie, and a little sweater, sleeveless sweater. And he said, this is the New York Yankees, Murray. You should really, go to Winona, Kansas, get a job. We got a newsroom full of people here who worked at the greatest papers in America.
Who was the famous writers there when you first started?
When I first started, Jimmy Breslin was there. Pete Hamill was there.
Wow. Were they like the
Dick Young was there.
Who was this? Great sport writer.
Who was the
Dick Young you mentioned? Pete Hamill.
Oh, yeah.
Breslin, Dick Young. They had tremendous Broadway columnists then.
Did they intimidate you with their
I wound up, not the newspaper guys, the news side guys. When I started, I was like on the overnight copy boy shift. The guy really started me at the bottom because I said
to him, what is that copy boy?
Oh, God. You do everything from getting coffee for reporters to collecting all their copy that they, in those days, people used typewriters. And there was actually,
we used to use typewriters to a few years ago in the NYPD, right?
So it was, it was a crummy hour, crummy days off, and all my friends were, had better normal jobs. And I'm working weekends and midnight.
It's a 24-hour thing, right?
Oh, yeah, it was totally.
You could work.
But it was great. It was great to be in contact with all these kind of characters and to become part of a world where all the names in the newspaper came alive, number one. But I knew I was on a path to meeting different kinds of people and having different kinds of life experiences and writing, and I wanted to write. So it was a great place to go.
Was everyone smoking cigarettes back then?
Smoking and drinking.
So the newsroom must have been like a cloud, right?
Yeah. There was no carpeting.
Did you smoke back then?
I did. I did.
And everyone quits, right?
Yeah.
So I'm still curious about the philosophy thing. So basically, philosophy major, you're studying like Homer and Socrates and stuff like that?
Well, not some of them, but mostly a little more current. I was a little more current.
Like who? Who's current?
We studied Aristotle and Plato. We studied, people like Kierkegaard and Sartre.
Plato was more current than Socrates?
No. Yeah, well, I think they were more contemporary.
Give me one modern day philosopher.
Sartre,
when was this?
He was
1980?
1900s.
Oh, okay. Give me the new one. Is there some
There's
guy?
nobody now I know.
Is there some guy making a breakthrough in philosophy right now?
DeMayo.
I'm not quite as up on my philosophers. Ed Mullins.
Modern day philosophy would probably be a rapper, right?
True. Yeah, that's true.
He's telling the thing in the streets. Yeah,
that's true. That's true.
So.
But it came in handy when I became the police bureau chief for the Daily News, being a philosophy major. It helped me a lot it helped me be a very good reporter. I studied, one of the things you studied was something called epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, how you know stuff. And fundamentally, it deals with truth. What's truth? And as a journalist, your goal is to seek the truth, not unlike investigative police officers.
Find out what really happened.
Trying to get really happened. So I remember once a class of Columbia students came through my bureau at police headquarters.
Downtown.
Yeah. And the professors, the class, of course, they're younger. They were younger than me. I was pretty young. I was probably the youngest bureau chief they ever had. But the students, of course, are interested in, how'd you get here? And I said, I study philosophy. And then I said to them, I used to discuss death. Now I cover it.
Yeah. So, that's great. That's a great
it's kind of cool.
What year was this, Maury?
Well, I joined the news in like 1974. I hate to say it because it sounds so long ago.
The city was a different place then,
Unbelievable.
Right?
I was 22.
So that's when you were 22 when you walked in, like with the sweater vest. And,
yeah. And I had to go over to the New York Times and get the newspapers off their printing presses when they came off and bring them back to the news. And I had to bring copies of the news to the Times because that was kind of they had a little arrangement that we'll see.
Quid pro quo there.
Exactly, right? Exactly. We'll see what you're publishing and what we have. The Daily News at the time was the biggest paper in America. Wow. I mean, by far, it was powerful and it was huge.
I saw that you mentioned that you wrote that somewhere. That no matter which paper you're working in, there's always one better. Is that something? A quote that I recall?
I don't.
Something close to that.
I'm not sure what. Yeah.
I read that in the background stuff. Just a comment basically on, what's the difference between the Post and the News. And you basically said no matter where you work, there's always a paper that's above you.
Yeah.
Something like that.
That's true. Well, the News was number one when I was there, and obviously it's not that well read any longer. And obviously the web has been a big change. The Post was actually, nobody went to the Post when I went to it. It was a major event when I left the Daily News.
Rupert Murdoch bought it, right?
Yeah.
So, you mentioned that, and between the two papers, nowadays, the Daily News and the New York Post, I couldn't tell you a cop that would read the Daily News. It's always the Post, and because one's biased, or we feel anyway as police officers that the Post backs us and the Daily News is against us.
Well, when I was at the Daily News was read by the police at that time. It was a working so-called working man's newspaper. Okay. And the police, we had a big bureau. When I joined their police bureau, I was
Tell us about that.
Well, I went from being a copy boy to being a reporter in about less than 2 years, which was pretty good. And then that 2-year period I worked for all these columnists. It was a lot of fun. The travel editor.
Sure.
I mean, I could tell you a million stories about that. But anyway, fast forward, I wound up working overnight. I worked in Queens. I worked in Brooklyn, each for about 6 months to a year. That was the drill back then. Then I worked overnight. And when you got off the overnight shift, the metropolitan editor kind of asked you where you wanted to go. And I said, I've been working nights for like a year and a half here. All I've been kind of doing is covering the police. So the one thing I don't want to do is really cover the police anymore. And I was doing investigative reporting when I was in Brooklyn and Queens. So, of course, they sent me to police headquarters. They was revamping the bureau there.
So where's your room in 1PP?
Oh, the Daily News had a big room with like 6 reporters on the second floor. It was on the second floor where the operation... real-time crime.
You guys even get the better parking spaces than I actually got. I got a ticket once parking in press parking at one.
Is that right?
He tried to steal your spot there.
Back then, the press had power.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's had a big problem with parking.
Yeah.
We had the department a little bit running in fear of us.
With these, like you said, you were an investigative reporter. What was it like in 1973, 75? Going out into real bad neighborhoods and maybe investigating shooting or a homicide?
That's an interesting thing for me. When I worked in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn editor decided that he wanted to have more coverage at night at civic association and board of ed meetings, and I would go out to East New York, Brooklyn at night. Interestingly, the editor was an African American guy, and he was sending me into East New York, and I'd go wander.
You weren't strapped either, right?
No. And I actually think that part of the reason that either I was on my toes enough to be cautious and careful, but riding the subways was all those years. People people have no idea how inherently frightening it was. Mm-hmm. How walking down corridors that weren't lit, you turn corners and you have no idea what's going to be there. It
was like when you walked with a candle through a haunted house in a movie. That's what the subways were like.
Only it's not a movie on TV. You're watching from the comfort of your couch.
Yeah.
So anyway, I always felt that part of the reason I didn't get harassed is that people assumed that I had to be a police officer. So why would a white guy be walking through? Yeah, and then walking through our neighborhood here with shirt and tie on. Yeah. He has to be a cop.
It's rare that you talk to somebody that remembers New York like that. When it was a different time, you try to explain to somebody how different neighborhoods had different boundaries and how you really wouldn't go into a certain neighborhood at night. Now, obviously, if you weren't working as a reporter, but I'm just saying the average civilian wasn't really going into certain neighborhoods. People would warn you against it. If you were on the subway and you were heading uptown somewhere about 96th Street, if you were still white, if they cared for you, they'd stop. Hey, my friend, white Conductor, stop. We got a white boy here. He needs to get off.
Wow. It was scary for everybody.
Yeah.
Not just me going through some of those neighborhoods. I remember, every year we used to do or I used to try to do a piece on the precinct that had the dubious distinction of having the most homicides.
Yeah.
So I remember one year I went up to the 44th precinct in the Highbridge section.
Yeah.
And I met the lieutenant up there. It was a nice guy. His name was Montanino. And he was really worn. He was worn, tired worn,
Sure.
but he was good. And he had a sergeant, his detective sergeant there. His name was, I think, Gaspari Bruno. And he was famously asked, what was this homicide about, And his answer was, it was a dispute. And then it was like, well, what was the dispute over? And he goes, it was a dispute over a dispute. That's how many homicides there were and why people were just killing each other. So anyway, but in that piece, it was a very touching piece, actually, and it was one of my, they ran the article above Jimmy Breslin's column.
Wow.
Which showed how much
good, right?
how much they really liked the story. But in the story, as you guys know, the 44th precinct up there, it's a very small geographic area. Mm-hmm. It includes Yankee Stadium,
Sure.
of course, but it's very small. And I remember I went and got the stats for how many people got killed, like in Nebraska, and the number was like, it was tiny compared
Sure.
to the number of people who were killed
in the 4-4.
In the 4-4, and I had all these comparisons just in the article, plus the litany of it had probably 100 and something homicides.
You described the lieutenant as being worn.
Yeah, he was worn.
What does that mean, worn to the average person?
I was interviewing him at the end of the year, and you start going through the crimes, and the crimes are, somebody went into a Chinese restaurant, they ordered chicken, and then they just shot the guy behind the counter and killed him, and they left with only the chicken, and the stories ran from that to, 3-year-old babies, battered by parents and killed, senseless, cruel, every day this is what, the guy comes to work and he's got on his board all the names of the dead and his charts with
back
what
then
we're
I
doing.
think the 4-4 was probably getting about 80 murders a year.
I think they topped 100 that year.
Did they really?
Yeah.
And robberies were just like, it was out of control.
So you're talking about a human being who's coming to work every day, and his job is to try to solve homicides, and he's got a growing list of people who were just murdered for no reason.
You think you have a touch of PTSD from all of these stories?
No, I don't.
You don't?
I don't. I hope not.
You've seen some horrendous things.
Late,
right?
yeah, but late, and I say late in my career, having been asked 1,000 times about, how do you cover? I mean, if you count the homicide cases that I've covered, it's in the tens of thousands.
Right.
And I'll tell you a quick aside on that in a moment, but. They say, and it does eat at you.
Sure.
It does eat at you. There's no doubt that it's saddening, it's crushing. It is tough even to talk about it this way. But when people go, how do you handle that? I came up with the following justification or balm to it all, or salve, if you will, is for every horrible crime, I met dozens of people who were trying to solve it.
Sure.
And they're all good people. And I met a lot of terrific people along the way. So I kind of take that as a way to balance out the negative of it. Yeah, definitely. To be honest with you.
Do you have one that sticks in your mind as the worst homicide you ever covered?
No, but obviously the first one that actually comes to mind is like Nick's Mary Brown, a child who who's chained and bound.
She was in the 2-6 in the cell, the lesbians that were there were two.
No. This is a young girl in Brooklyn,
right,
a child.
No, I thought it was the two with the chained to a radiator. That was up.
No, that's
Brooklyn,
a different one.
No, I remember the case. She was
but anyway, terrible story. But those are bad, and you kind of just shake and you kind of try to move beyond them.
You think when you write a story about that, the public can really understand the horror of it from how you write the story?
I try to not only write the story in whatever detail as best I can, either from official sources or unofficial sources. And I remember a source of mine on that story actually was a high-ranking police official in Brooklyn, and he was quick to steer me toward a point to make. There was a failure. There was a government failure, and there was some issues surrounding it that he wanted highlighted. You know, reporters are only as good as the information you get.
Sure.
And sometimes we think of angles that we want to pursue on stories, like why did this happen? How did the child welfare people come and visit this house? Who may have, you know, are there...
Drop the ball.
Yeah, well, not necessarily to hang somebody, but if there's faults in a system, you know, if the system fails, you know, you try to do stories that have some impact that maybe change the way the game is played so that this doesn't happen again. And I remember being told, I can't remember specifically what it was, but I do recall that there was a very concerned police official of high rank who obviously trusted me, and he was a source of mine. And he made a point to me, and I went and pursued it, and it made I think it had an impact. That story had an impact just based on the sheer
makes you feel
horror.
Speaking of sources,
Yeah.
when you get to these crime scenes, right? A lot of people don't realize, obviously, there's crime scene tape, and you have to be on the outside of it. And you have probably a little area where most of you guys hang out.
Yeah.
Now, being on crime scenes, especially as a young detective, and thinking to myself, I don't know the rules, I can't talk to these people. It would be like the scariest thing whenever one of you guys be like, hey, detective, what happened? I'm like, I don't know. Nothing happened. And I would just run back inside because I didn't want to go on the record saying anything.
Sure.
I didn't know if I was allowed to.
That's a problem for reporters.
But now, but not only that, but then who are your sources? It becomes the neighborhood. So you start asking possible witnesses that are in the area, did you see anything, obviously, the same way we do. Now...
And sometimes they don't see it the way, or they see a piece of it.
Everybody sees it their own way, but with us, the same way you were getting it from us, that's the way we get it from most people. Nah, I didn't see nothing, see nothing. You know, you have to kind of sort of dig a little bit more. With reporters, on the other hand, I think you guys have, with the regular neighborhood people, those possible witnesses, I think you have an easier way with them, don't you?
Well, you know, we're not law enforcement, so you know, sometimes people will tell us things that they won't tell law enforcement people.
And how true is it, though? I mean, how do you have an instinct that this person's bullshitting me or not, or do you always take it for whatever they say?
No, you can't take it for just what they say. You have to understand that this is, you know, I don't want to go back to philosophy here, but I mean, stories are like, you know, pentagons and hexagons. They have multiple sides to them, and you know, your job as a journalist is to try to get all the sides. And,
well, my point is, you know, when you get to the scene and the cops won't talk to you, and then all of a sudden, you know, out of these three witnesses, this guy is actually, you know, he's the closest thing to like a...
Well, some reporters will just run with whatever gets said, and
so
then
let me just put
the police get
take
pissed.
this little piece and put that piece and put that together just to get it out.
Right.
And then the story kind of unfolds as the story goes along, depending on how much traction it gets.
Correct.
How popular it is in that at that time.
Well, you got to vet the information, whether it's coming from the police department or whether it's coming from a witness on the street.
Correct.
You can't just take what the police department says, and you can't take what a witness on the street says. The police department may have a spin they want to put on it.
Of course,
right?
but you'd like to believe the police department is a little more honest in their whatever.
But when we read the paper,
what they tell you,
and we were at the scene the night before,
right?
And you're telling somebody this didn't happen, this is what happened. You know what I'm saying? And I know why that happens is because we're not talking to you for the most part.
Right. That happens.
And then you're getting all of your hearsay from the street. So I'm just imagining the job is pretty difficult to try to put all this stuff together and for an article that, you know, that's probably going to change and evolve.
Well, I'd like to think when I first... Listen, I don't want to self-congratulate here, but a guy that was like a deputy mayor many years ago when I first started said he loved to read my crime stories, you know, in the newspaper every day. So because when he read them, he really felt he got the full story. And I didn't realize how great a compliment that was until many, many years later. Yeah. But it's true. It's true in the sense that for me personally, I can't speak for all reporters. I think the goal is that. The goal is that, and the police department, you know, they play a role in what the information is, and when they're not participating in that, you know, they run the risk of, you know, a vacuum being filled. that they
Are you
lose. They
playing
lose.
detective along the way there too a little
Sure.
bit?
Oh, sure.
Because
Sure.
like I said, the police probably aren't talking
Sure.
to you. Maybe you got a couple of good leads of the witnesses in the street, and then all of a sudden you start looking around and start putting together what you think might have happened, right?
Correct. But I learned a long time ago that reporters, you think you know something, and you know 10 facts, and let's say the police department or the detectives know 80 facts because you guys have access and power we don't have. And you talk to reporters, and they actually think they know something. And then one more fact comes in, and the whole story changes because they learned something else. And
Well,
you
one of the big
always have to keep that in mind.
One of the big
Always.
problems is speed and accuracy are not friends. And reporters want to put it out quickly.
Particularly today.
Yeah, and you cannot get the truth quickly.
Particularly
it
today.
It takes time. Investigation takes time.
Particularly today.
Talk about
because of
that. Talk about the
way
news
it is.
cycle the way it is now compared to obviously.
Well, I was in the newspaper business for a very long time, and I did a lot of stories on crushing deadlines. Particularly, I worked in the evenings. There'd be an incident, say a police officer gets shot.
Tell us what that's like, that deadline thing.
Oh, back then, it's an incredible experience. There's a woman named Mary McGrory, and she once said, I always felt sorry for people who never worked at a newspaper. and there's some truth to that in the sense that, it's 11 p.m. and something happens, and you're trying to get the story very quickly. Why? The whole production aspect of a newspaper is so different than today's world of digital news and instantaneous news. And you're mindful of getting and then the writing process, and it's on paper back then, and then the piece of paper gets handed to somebody else who edits it or reads it, and then it gets sent downstairs to the printers who linotype it. Then it goes through the whole paper process and into the trucks and delivered, and then people read it maybe 5, 6, 7 hours later. But they're getting, police officer shot, here's what happened, da-da-da-da-da. And that's like, in those days, instant news. But it's a process that takes hours, actually, and you're at the front end of it. So you're really trying to gather stuff very quickly and get it out very quickly. In today's world, people want to gather stuff quickly and get it out. The process that you go through to get it out. Now, I was at the Daily News for a long time. My resume is, I was a reporter there. I became the police bureau chief there, a chief investigative reporter. I worked at City Hall. Then I left. I became a criminal justice editor at the New York Post. I worked out of the newsroom. At one point, I actually ran the newsroom for Pete Hamill when the Post was almost closing and going out of business. It was a wacky period. And I've done a tremendous amount of investigative reporting. Then I left and I went to write a news column at DNA Info, which was an all New York News website and digital. But anyway, in that world,
Go ahead.
To circle back, is that you want to beat your competition on stories. I'm as competitive as the next guy.
Right.
But all you have to do is push a button and it's published. And so that
You can't get it back.
That instantaneous moment can happen like that, as
And
opposed
you
to
want to pull it back. Wait, that's not right.
you can't stop the process once it goes. What I learned in that's fascinating, is you lose the creative end of it, because once it's out, everybody steals it. They almost forget where it started.
When I was in homicide as a sergeant in homicide from 2002 to 2011, I used to write what we called the bullets, and then it became the police, the preliminary investigative worksheet.
Yeah, I used to love getting them.
Right, that was used to brief the police commissioner and the press.
Well, I used to hopefully get them before the police commissioner.
Oh, okay, yeah. But those were tough to write because it was like writing a term paper at work, And like you say, you don't have all the facts yet. So you're writing this. Sometimes it would take 6 or 7 hours to write. They're like, it has to be done by 6 in the morning. And I'd be like, and captains would read it and say, you got to change this. I'd be, fuck you, I'm not changing shit, because it was so stressful writing the thing,
Well, when we go to court to testify on a red light summons, you'll get a piece of paper this way, and it's basically like fill in the blanks.
Right.
On so-and-so, this, that, and the other. So when you're writing an article, is it almost like that in a way? Like, do you have, because you become so good at it, you talked about deadline, you talked about editing, there has to be a format this has to, I have to mention this has to go here, this, that, and the other. So you already know before you start writing the things.
Most times. There was a guy, I think there was some guy who worked for a San Francisco newspaper who once said he had like a folder file that was like, there's only like 50 stories
like
and they're all sorted. Yeah. But I
Well,
personally, I don't agree with that.
We had the folder in the detective squad, the 49 folder. That's a
unusual occurrence.
Occurrence thing that we have to. So you'd go in the folder, you'd find one that was similar to your incident, and then you would just fill in the date and the times.
Well, I would say the journalism part of it is a little more complicated. That particularly if you're really trying to craft a story, as you were saying before, that really has impact when people read it.
Uh-huh.
Your selection of quotes, some of the words you choose, how you.
Yeah, you guys were like the best writers.
How you say
the worst
something.
writers were on the NYPD. Those,
Well,
a lot of those
I agree with
reports
that.
that you read.
He didn't like my PIWs.
No,
Oh my God! And TPO, like the most boring.
I taught everybody that ever worked for me, don't trust New York City police spelling.
The spelling. Yeah,
Don't ever, and that includes the names of the victims.
I had
Sometimes.
so many things I want to know. Okay, so you obviously worked. We're going to cover 48 hours, but before we get there, one of the jobs before that was DNA. You talked
Right.
about. You wrote for them.
Right.
So now you're coming out of, the history of newspapers, like exactly what everybody can envision what it was like. But now you're going into the digital era because this is a different format. How well did you adjust? How easy was that? What's the difference?
It was an adjustment. It was an adjustment, particularly. I think the thing that was most troubling is what I alluded to before, is that you'd work on something and you'd have a scoop, and as soon as it was published, it was like, choom.
Everyone else stole your
It
material.
gets also the power of it. I'll be honest with you, the power of the internet. When you worked at a newspaper, it's an amazing phenomenon. You work in a newspaper, and you ride the subway, and you can actually see people reading your stories. And particularly in the earlier years, I didn't have my photograph with every column or story I wrote, which happened.
You ever see a hot girl in the subway reading your article and you start moving next to her? Well, okay, look at that.
What is Taylor's name tag?
Yeah, right. My little ID card. I wish I had that kind of chutzpah, so to speak. I might have fared a little better. I'm not sure if my girlfriends at the time would have liked it, but even if it's not my own story. But the thing is that you kind of know hundreds of thousands of people. Like the Daily News just sell like 1.5 million a day, and the Post was at almost close to 1,800,000. So you're on the front page, you're on page 2. People are reading your stories. I'm already thinking, what's tomorrow's story? That was kind of my thing. But it's laying around. People are reading it. It's a physical entity, and you also it's getting passed around. It lays on a desk. You're reading it, then you're reading it. But for somebody to respond to you. You get like a letter in the mail 5 days later, maybe.
Now it's like right away.
So you're giving out a story, and it's like shoom, it spreads, and you can see it. You can actually see it spreading on the internet. You can see people picking it up, following it, sharing it, and similarly, depending on what it is, you can get a feedback from it. And the feedback can be very good, and it can be like you're an asshole, you should be fired.
When you get a story that is so huge and that you're covering it, do you get that extra adrenaline? And talk about that.
Yes. Not only do I get it on stories that breaking stories, or I will. I'll give you a couple of examples. But the adrenaline from a big story, and then having access to something that makes this story even bigger or more important, or investigative reporting, which when you get access to stuff or you work. I mean, I used to work on breaking stories and stories every day, and I was also doing investigative reporting at the same time. So when you work on investigative pieces, there are moments where there are real breakthroughs, not unlike homicide cases. You're working, you can't get it, and then you find something, or something turns up, and it's like the eureka piece, and you know that you have it. Now, the great thing for you guys is, you can go out and do something about it, but for a journalist, now you have to sit down and write the whole story. And that can be a torturous process.
That's tough,
but I've had experiences, and thousands of them, where people.
Is there a one big story?
I could give you a great example. Yeah,
give
this is
us
a
an
great
example.
example. This is a great example. So I was working at City Hall for the Daily News in August of 1986. I'd been the police bureau chief for the Daily News, and this is in the 80s, so there's 1,500, 1,800 homicides. It's a crazy busy 24/7 thing. You guys, homicide in Upper Manhattan, you work on some cases and you're really busy, and then you get some downtime when when you solve it. But if there's 4 people killed in Brooklyn the next day, Murray is off to Brooklyn.
He's off to Brooklyn.
So that
Never thought of
that treadmill is permanent.
Yeah,
that
never
treadmill is
thought of that.
permanent. So I'm working at City Hall, and the deputy metropolitan editor calls me up, and he says, "Hey Murray, there's this girl got killed in the park yesterday, and they have a college kid in custody. And I know you're not our police bureau chief anymore, and we're taking a shot, but do you think you might be able to help us find out, what it was like for that boy in custody last night?" And I said to him, there can't be but 3 people in the room with the suspect. Mm-hmm. And they said, I know, we know, but we just thought we'd ask. And I kind of knew when I said it that I had a shot, because I was friends with the homicide lieutenant who was the boss. Mm-hmm. And I rang him up and I said, "Hey, can you help me with this homicide of the girl in the park?" And he said, "Yeah, I was
talking
there."
about Jennifer Levin?
Yeah, Jennifer Levin.
Mm-hmm.
The
Robert
Preppy
Chambers
killer.
case.
Yeah, what became known as the Preppy Murder case.
Robert Chambers.
Right. So, but when I got the phone call and I called the source of mine, who I only identify as a source because he's dead.
Right.
At the time, I would never reveal anything like this. But he said, "Yeah, I was there." I said, "So what was it like for the kid?" And he said, "Well, here's what he said." And he gave me Robert Chambers' confession in real time.
Wow.
In real time, like while it was happening. And I never forgot this. I had a yellow legal pad on my desk in room 9 in City Hall, and I was writing. I was taking it down in longhand, and the whole thing, the yoking, the panties behind his back, holding his hands behind his back, and my hand was shaking. I couldn't quite believe what I was hearing. And I called into the newsroom, and I told the deputy metropolitan editor the confession, and he was like, "What do you got to tell this to higher than me?" And I told it to the metropolitan editor, and he was like, "Murray, what are you saying?" And I said to him, "What I'm saying, Arthur, is he's saying he killed her during rough sex." And those 2 words I introduced to the American vernacular.
Well, that's amazing.
And they were like walking around the newsroom. "Hey, Murray's saying it's
That
during rough sex."
became his defense, too.
Yeah.
Cover
Yes.
the paper.
Yes.
Cover
And it
the
became
paper.
page 1. And years later, when I went to the Post Metropolitan editor, one night we were chatting, and he said, "The day you published that rough sex story was the worst day of my newspaper life."
Because he worked for the other
He worked for the
newspaper.
competition.
That's
and he got a
interesting.
phone call at home.
But Murray,
that
the
the Daily
interesting
News
thing
is
is that
publishing this account.
became a defense down the road, even
Forever.
after that.
Yeah.
People use, which
On Long
is
Island,
it
that's
continues.
incredible.
There was
Yeah.
a-
Continues to be a
Yes.
defense.
Yeah. Yep.
How do you feel about that, Murray?
Hey, I'm not the attorney. I'm only reporting what Robert
Jack
Chambers
Lippman
said.
ran with
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
He was
Yep.
Robert
Yep.
Chambers' attorney.
Yep. But
That's-
that was a
That's a scene from
that
a
was
movie
huge,
right
yeah,
there.
that was a huge moment for me. But I've had quite a number of experiences exactly like that on very big stories.
I can see, when I used to get a big homicide that was like, I knew was like a huge case, I would get that feeling too, that adrenaline, and then I just wanted to push my guys and help
Yeah, I never
solve
got
this
that
case,
at all.
So
Ever.
Can I tell you another story? Want to hear another story?
Yeah,
Sure.
love it. This is what you hear, man. We
Oh,
want to
okay.
hear all
That's
of
what I'm
them.
here for.
Stories are great.
So you may recall there was a volcanic explosion in Midtown one day, and everybody thought maybe it's another terrorist event. And it turned out like it was a huge underground explosion. Cavern opened up like on 45th Street, and a car fell into it. A woman
Yeah,
was
vaguely remember
killed,
that vaguely,
and there
yeah.
were huge plumes of smoke, and they evacuated buildings because they thought it was a terrorist thing, and it made the evening news. It was a huge story, and that was like on a Thursday, I think. So I came to work on Friday. So I covered that story, right? And it wasn't a terrorist event. But it was a massive Con Ed kind of thing. And I came in the next morning, and I called a friend of mine who was a source that I had in the fire department, and he actually told me, there was another person in that car. that nearly was killed. It wasn't killed. And I was like, really?
You got to talk to him or her.
Yeah. So he gave me the name. He told me the hospital, and I phoned it in. And we went up to the hospital. We interviewed this woman. And like here, it's 10:30 in the morning. And I'm like, hey, got page 1 scoop for tomorrow.
Wow.
Right? I was very happy. But here's the interesting part of this story. Is I was going on vacation the next day, allegedly. And vacations in me never existed.
Vacation is
they
done.
never existed. They never really existed.
Allegedly.
So go to Jones Beach instead.
Almost.
Cover
I was
story.
actually supposed to go out to the island and play some golf for a few days with some people. But anyway, I had gotten a tip that morning as well that that the FBI was investigating maybe a referee for betting on games.
Oh,
an NBA
yeah,
game.
wow, this is great.
So I gave them this page 1 story, which everybody's like, oh, this is great. We found another victim. We got exclusive pictures in the hospital. I survived this volcanic whatever. And then I realized around 2 or 3 in the afternoon that I hadn't followed up on this tip, and I'm going away for a week.
The one about the basketball.
About the basketball guy, right? And the editor of the newspaper was aware of this. So I knew that sometime in the day, there's a very good chance that I'm going to get a phone call. Like, hey, by the way, whatever happened with that basketball
Your
tip?
golf date is fucked.
Right? Oh, yeah. Well, you know where this story's going. So around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm like, holy shit, I haven't made any calls on this other thing. And I'm going away, supposedly. So I started calling some people I knew here in New York about the FBI. And one of them said to me, you know, you really should call somebody in Washington about this.
Oh, wow.
Which signaled to me that there was some truth to it. So I wound up calling somebody in Washington that I knew, who used to work in New York, and was down in Washington. And this person, I'll never forget this. This person says to me, oh, hold on, Murray, for a second. So I hold on. He says, I think I saw something like this. And I can hear the paper. He's going through paper on his desk. And I'm just sitting there silently. And he goes, oh, yeah, here it is. And then he says to me, you know, you got to call the New York office about this. So now he's telling me, I got paperwork on my desk that you're right. So then I call back to New York, and I basically tell them, you know, that I have the story. And
But you don't even have the story. I mean,
I had it now. No, I
Okay.
told him what I had.
Okay.
And he was like, you know, he was confirming that he had it, that I had it. It's on my desk, so you got to call the New York office officially, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I did, and they said to me, you know, we're going to get back to you because people's lives may be at stake. But now I knew I had the story, right? So,
And we're talking about the story that there's a movie coming out about it now, right? The referee that was.
I don't know if they're doing a movie on it. There's been a lot of
What's the
talk.
story about? The referee that was skimming, right? He was.
He was in bed.
NBA, right?
He was
The white
in
guy,
bed with some.
the Irish guy, right?
He was in bed. Yeah, Tim Donaghy is.
There's a movie coming out right now
Oh,
this
yeah?
month about
Oh,
it.
yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
All about that.
How
Yeah.
come you weren't given a part?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, we keep.
I need a SAG card.
I want to get to this is so interesting to me. We keep talking about source. You mentioned that the word source a lot.
Right.
Now, also, how many different type of sources? As a reporter in New York City, to make your way around, to make your job work better for you, you have to know everybody, everywhere,
Right.
and have a good relationship with them.
Yeah.
In order to make your job easier, also you can help them too, right?
Yeah. Well,
So you know, you're going to know people down in court. You're going to know people, obviously the cops. You're going to know people in restaurants. That's important to know.
restaurants, yes, very important.
You ever get?
Very
Like,
important.
you ever get?
Elaine's
you ever
was
get-
a good place.
Did you ever get charged for a meal
Mira's.
and squeeze that into a story about how bad that restaurant is?
No.
Because they charged you. No, you
No,
never did that.
no.
You never squeezed like.
I don't know. Maybe that's a. Yeah, I was gonna say maybe that's
Oh,
a
I
police
forgot.
thing.
That's a cop thing.
That
Yeah,
might be a police thing.
that's what we would do.
I don't. No. Well, you know, we have expensive.
But I'm
accounts,
just talking
so
about the personality
sometimes
that
we
it
can-
takes to be a good reporter in this. I mean, everybody remembers Jimmy Breslin so much,
I
that
think-
bigger
well-
than life character. You're the same way too, easygoing, a real New Yorker. You could talk to everybody. That's important, right?
It's very important. You know, people ask me, even reporters, you know, how do you get your sources? And I say, well, you cover stories every day for 7 years, and you'll get some sources.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality of that is that people deal with you, If you quote them accurately and they read your story, then the next time maybe they'll talk to you again.
These are like your CIs, your confidential informants out there, right?
Yeah, no.
We use CIs and you have sources.
If you have like 4 or 5 lieutenants in homicide around town, you're set for life.
Golden, right?
Yeah, you're good.
But
for
how do you start these relationships?
I think it's a phone call at a time, to be honest with you.
You start off, you're not waiting for an initial meeting at a crime scene, actually, right?
No. There's sometimes you meet people when you go to crime scenes, but as my career moved, I didn't go as much to the crime scenes, but I dealt with people a lot, at police headquarters, telephonically. And then when I started, the police reporters covered the police department, but whatever my personality, there were a tremendous amount of policy issues emerging. There were issues about merging the various police departments in the city. There were race issues. There were hiring issues. There were corruption issues. There were issues about revolving doors of justice, that the courts couldn't handle the volume of crime. And many of these issues still exist today in a different way, obviously. But as the bureau chief, I kind of expanded my reach, if you will. I started covering terrorist cases, organized crime cases. I dealt a lot with the FBI. I knew prosecutors. I even knew judges.
These young reporters that are working under you, because you're like the bureau chief now, right?
At that time, yeah.
So if they came back to you with the lead, a lot of times you're like, oh, you know what? I know the lieutenant over there. Let me give him a call.
I could help them.
So that's how it kind of sort of works in a way, yeah.
Sure. Or I tell them what to do.
It behooves, though, cops to also have a relationship with reporters. Why?
Why is it good for cops?
Yeah.
That's a peculiar that's a really good question, because sometimes I often wonder.
Because we're always nervous until we get to know.
Not all of you are nervous.
Not all of us, but you're talking about
level.
seasoned guys. And before you get seasoned, you have to.
The world was different. When I started, the relationship between the press and police was a lot more interactional. Then it changed. It changed. Listen, if you when I started, cops and reporters hung out a lot more.
Yeah.
I mean, there were guys who used to come down from the Major Case Squad.
Sure.
I was a young reporter, so they weren't coming down to see me, but they were coming down to the Daily News office to BS with some of the older reporters who were there. They became friends.
Well, when there's like a give and take, like you can help the police and the police can help you, that's a good thing.
I think to answer your question really honestly, I think it depends on the. First of all, if you look at the old movies, the cops and the reporters were always together.
He's got his hat is bent up.
Hey. Get that idea. So,
hey, Captain, let me ask you a question.
Yeah, and the press had a lot of power, but when I first started, the administration that was in power, they had a very strong feeling about that providing information to the press and having a relationship with them was part of the public service aspect of the police department, that we are a public entity and that we function better when we interact with the public, where the public knows what we're doing, that we're not a secret society. And I came around post-Knapp Commission. So there was a sense that, the police department had, its corruption issues, and when they were trying to clean it up, they felt that part of the reason that the corruption existed is that they were a closed society, not open to enough public scrutiny, and the administration opened up. So I came in an era where the department itself saw its advantage in being open, being communicating with the public, and also the public had a right to know a lot of stuff.
But Murray, I just want to
and that's changed.
Throw something out there.
I want to be clear that
I think
changed.
the police department now has a sort of a philosophy of almost giving too much to the press. And from my point of view, when I was in homicide, it hurt our cases because the department had this thing through DCPI.
Did it really hurt your case?
Yeah.
You lost the case?
No, it threatened witnesses by putting their names in the paper,
I see.
or perpetrators that were ID'd that we needed a statement from, they put their name in the paper. Now the guy's going to lawyer up. So that's the part that I
made
really
your job
object.
harder.
Yeah, much harder, and almost impossible sometimes.
Well, to go back to the point that I was trying to get at, you need to rely a little bit on getting information from the police for your stories, but how can the average cop up there, because you mentioned something, major crime, being somewhere socializing, But I'm talking about before the cop becomes like this detective or a seasoned cop. You know, he's got to have that interaction. What benefit is it for the cop? Like, what can we? No, there has to be, because a lot of times I want to let stuff out to the public.
Why?
About my case.
Why?
To help me catch my person.
Oh, I see.
So I want to set almost like a trap up.
Right.
And you're my
You're
source.
use me. You're
You're
gonna
my
use
source.
me.
Yes.
I see.
Because we have this relationship.
Is this a disinformation campaign?
No. It's a real thing. I mean,
I
there's situations where you want to get
Right.
somebody out. Maybe the witness is dirty,
Right,
too.
right.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And they're not giving you the information that
Well,
you're trying to get out of them. So we're gonna divulge a little bit. Hey, just so you know, check out the witness because they're dirty too. Right?
Yeah.
And that helps my case.
Right.
So before we get to that point, I want the cops out there to use the reporters the same way they use us.
Well,
you know what I'm saying?
You can.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's reporters like.
Can we trust you?
Well, you got to find somebody you can trust.
Yeah.
But you also have to be careful that you're not trying to, as a reporter, you have to be very careful that people aren't using you.
Like what I just said.
And that you're actually being played potentially, with bad information, not necessarily good information. Journalists have to make a decision what they print. But I'm always open to hearing anything from anybody. That was sort of my philosophy.
Well, it seems like your job in some ways is a lot like ours, getting out the truth and finding the truth, and it's not always easy to find.
And
the
the best ones are social. The best ones are the ones that know how to go out there. They learn their neighborhood, wherever their environment where they're working, and they're not afraid. They're social people.
Yeah.
You could just go and you have to have that ability to start talking to anybody.
Yeah.
A good
Did you
detective
cry
can
when
start-
they closed the lanes?
I was there when they closed it. I closed it a few nights myself.
What do you drink, Murray? What's your drink?
Well, I
like a Scotch
evolved
guy
it.
to me.
No, I probably was. I evolved into martinis.
Oh, now you're a martini, but you were a Scotch drinker. I was a bartender.
Martinis.
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 I was a bartender. Sometimes I can really almost predict what someone drinks by looking at them.
I was a Scotch guy in my younger career.
Younger days. Now you're a martini guy.
Yeah.
Vodka?
Yes. Yes.
Well, you know what? We're approaching the end of the first hour. We're going to take a break after that. But before we go, just so you can start thinking about some of the stuff that I want to talk to you about, I want to talk to you about the new term, fake news. I want to also talk about, we covered a little bit about the Jennifer Levin. I want to hear more about that. But also, too, the John Edwards story was very interesting to me. When you get involved in a story like that where it can alter well, let's end on that one. I mean, you're a reporter right now. Well, who was you doing that story for at the time?
TNA Info, the John Edwards story.
Okay, so that's interesting too, because now we're in this new media age. It's digital, and the story is going to be updating itself constantly, right? Mm-hmm. So how did you come across this? Because that's a big. The source in that story is huge too.
Yeah.
Because they were trying to tell you it didn't happen, but you really trusted your source. Tell us about it.
Well, the John Edwards story they're referring to was during the what they call the Millionaire Madam case, or the soccer mom.
John Edwards was running for president at the time.
Right.
And this was against Clinton? Or Bush?
I don't recall, actually.
Well, he was a Democrat.
He was trying to get the nomination.
He was trying to get the nomination.
So he was running against Bush.
Yeah. He was trying to get the Democratic nomination.
Yeah.
And I knew somebody in law enforcement who I had interacted with many, many times on some other stories I did, and some of them were investigative stuff that I uncovered some wrongdoing, and it wound up in the hands of somebody.
So it wasn't you at the prostitutes? Like,
no.
Hey, you know who was just here? John Edwards. That wasn't you there?
No.
Murray, you're never going to guess who was just here.
Right.
That's not how you got it?
That can happen, but not in this. Not that. That's funny. I'll tell you when I first. No, I can't tell you about how I met Gandolfini. But anyway, so Edwards.
Now you open up that can of worms. That's coming up in the second
He
hour.
was trying to get the nomination from John Kerry. I think John Kerry was running for the same time.
You have to forgive my memory about that case.
So go ahead.
But what I do remember is that this law enforcement person who I was talking to was involved in that case, and was intimate with.
They were going after the madam.
Yeah. And everybody was like, "What's it? She has a black book. Whose names are in the book?" Kind of thing. And it
Which
turned
annoyed
out-
me, by the way. There was like one thing that was left in life was that bond that you had between you and
your prostitute.
Yeah, you and the prostitutes that you saw. Like that was
You
like
and
a
your
bond.
hoe.
You never broke that bond, and when you broke that bond, you know what? All hell's loose
Yeah.
at this point.
So, well, what can I say? My goal was to find out whatever. So anyway, this source of mine said that there was a very popular senator.
Oh wow!
Was and you know, after a little
Digging.
and talking to him, you know, he was making me guess. Really, I eventually.
Is that what a lot of it is? Like this
Sometimes.
thing, like I can't really tell you,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
he may
If you
be
guess
running
it,
for
he may be
running
president.
for president, right? And
you guess it, I'll tell you.
He has
He's
great.
in one
he
of
has-
the two parties. He's very handsome.
He's got great hair. Great hair. Great hair.
So you
Blah, blah,
narrowed it
blah.
down. So you guessed it, right?
Yeah. Well, So when I went with that story, I'd say that was on paper an enormously risky story. And in fact, after the story came
That's
out,
what I thought when I read it.
he was represented by Abby Lowe, who had represented Bill Clinton in when he had his scandals. And Abby Lowe communicated with the owner of DNA Info and the lawyers that he was, you know, they were going to sue, kind of
Pressure,
thing.
right?
And they put pressure on all the rest of the media, saying, you know, if Mr. Weiss is he's libeling our client, and if you rebroadcast or reprint what he's saying, then we could sue you for libel.
Trying to kill the story even before it starts.
And in fact, I was supposed to do an interview with the Today Show that day, and they waffled and they backed off
because
so
they didn't
he-
want to cover it.
Yeah,
The pressure.
well-
that's amazing because
Well,
we
you
read
know,
about
the
pressure
lawyer.
all the time
You
now.
know, Maury, I just want to mention one thing
Lord.
because you mentioned NBC.
Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned
But
NBC.
they backed out of doing the Harvey Weinstein case because of some political connections behind the scene with Farrow. What's his name? His first
Ronan
name?
Farrow.
Ronan Farrow.
Yeah.
And he offered it to them, and they refused to run it.
Right.
So
Allegedly.
allegedly, right. But you can understand some of the political pressure.
Well,
behind
this
the
was
scenes.
a legal issue, and the attorneys for John Edwards made it clear that if I was libeling Mr. Edwards and they were going to rebroadcast or broadcast me libeling him on their show, then they could be.
But
held
you stuck to your
liable.
guns.
Oh yeah.
You said no. My source.
Oh, and
is
then the
good.
New York Times the next day confirmed it with the Manhattan District Attorney's office.
Let's just say, for argument's sake,
And that was a very that was I won't
Could
say it
you
was a happy
imagine-
moment for me.
Because
but it was a bit
that
relieving.
was a huge story.
Yeah, it was.
But can you imagine if you just called up your source one last time, like, "Hey, listen, just so you know, I'm gonna get you a big trouble of this."
Right.
He goes, "Hey, you know what? I forget whether it was that guy.
Yeah,
I was
you're right.
drinking last
Might have
night.
been, yeah.
Oh man.
Well, you know, there's a famous scene in All the President's Men, if you recall, where he I think it's Dustin Hoffman is talking to his source, and he says, you know, the guy's like, well, if I count to 10 and you're still on the phone, it means this. And the guy misunderstood. They misunderstood each other, and he got it wrong.
Yeah.
He
I
got
gotta
it
watch
wrong.
that over again.
Yeah, no, it's a great scene. And I never forgot that because it's you know, knock wood, I don't think I've ever published anything that was
Did you
inaccurate.
count to 10?
Let's close on this. Because we'll pick up
John
on this.
Edwards was client number 10.
Oh, yeah, right, exactly.
We got to end this first hour. Let's close on this, and then we'll pick up on it when we come back. But when you break a story like that, obviously most of the stories that you're gonna do, you could change somebody's life. You have to accept that.
True.
But this is a huge thing. That's an event. Is there any? Forget about legality, all that. Just personal trepidation, like
Yes.
because we've all sinned.
Yes.
Do you know what I'm saying? Is
Yes.
there any guilt that comes out of it? Or maybe like a hesitance? I don't want to get this guy in trouble. He seems like a cool dude, but this is my job.
Well, if you recall, John Edwards had already been in trouble by having, I think, an extramarital affair or having
Yes,
a child out of wedlock.
Allegedly.
So this story...
That he lied about,
I think,
too.
Yeah. So this story really was a little bit...
An add-on to that.
It was, well, I won't say like a pile-on, but it was more part of a pattern of something. So
Think about
it
a
wasn't-
story.
Would I have done that story had he not had that previous scandal?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, think about that,
that
because
would've
I want to
been-
know if you ever broke a story that you realize, oh, this is the first of its kind. Nobody knows this about this particular person or this particular entity, and I could really, really do some damage, even though eventually it's
Right,
going to
I
come out
understand.
anyway, though, right?
Not always. No.
No?
No.
All right.
No.
So we're gonna pick up. This was great. Thanks for the first half. We're gonna come back. We're gonna refresh our
We
coffee.
should just say also that he now works for CBS 48
Well,
hours.
correct.
Before we do break,
As a TV producer.
That's right.
we covered a lot.
great.
But the most important thing, the reason why we're here today, is because you are the executive producer.
No, I'm a producer at 48 Hours.
At 48 hours.
Yes.
I was just trying to give you
The
a
number
bump up.
one rated show in America for 30 years on Saturday night.
Wow.
Yes.
They have 60 minutes on
So
Sunday
you're
night.
making big coin now.
These things are all relative, as you know.
No
Well,
one
you know
wants
what?
to say
I
that.
wanted to ask you that too. Like how much a reporter makes remind me the second hour. Actually,
Not much.
Not much.
I'm
Not
just
much.
curious.
But he gets
Like,
rewarded
do it
down
for
the
love.
line
We do
because
it
he
for
wouldn't be
love.
at 48 hours if he wasn't a reporter for 30
all for
years.
love.
Yeah, it's all for love. That's true.
All right, on the second half, we're going to learn more about 48 Hours, and we're going to pick up where we left off over here. We're talking to Murray Weiss, man. Great reporter.